Just looking out over this room and seeing how much things have grown, I know that at some point this morning we've crossed the 1,500 mark in registration. We're on our way to the largest conference we've ever had, and we've been working for a few years now with a research economist who's been tracking the growth of craft distilling. If you've been to our conference before, you must be familiar with our State of the Industry address, and I'd like to ask Michael Kinstlick to come up and tell you again how we're growing.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Baltimore. Thank you, Drew and Bill, for having me again. I also want to thank Karen for those wonderful comments. I would echo every single one of them. I think it's really important for those of us in a position to help others succeed and achieve their goals to do so, and that's one of the reasons that I like coming here and sharing this information with all of you. So broadly speaking, the topics that I like to address in this conversation is, how many craft distilleries are out there now, what are they making, where are they, and where are we in that market development cycle. So looking out now, we have, over the last 10 or 11 years now of ADI directories, not quite 1,200 unique listings over that time. And in this current year, over 1,000 unique listings in the ADI directories. That compares to 2,100 listings in a recent TTB permit holders file. That's available online. Anyone can go and look at that. And so I'm estimating that there are about 1,150 craft distilleries now in operation, of which I identified not quite 900 in operation at the end of 2016. The remainder, that gap, are what I think of as known and estimated hidden entrants, and I'll get to that in a moment. And we still see the number of entrants doubling roughly every 3 years. So this is a chart, I want to start with this one, of the number of entrants in the TTB DSP file. So I've been tracking this now for the last several years, and around the middle of 2013, late 2012, early 2013, we saw that curve start to turn up. And so we're running at a rate of an increase of about 300 a year now in that file. I think the difference over 2016 ended up at about not quite 300, and it was like 280, and it was a combination of about 300 adds, new entrants in that file, and about 50 drops, former entrants that faded out. Most of those drops are from big names you would recognize. They're relicensing or change of location from Chalone Winery or Gallo or Diageo, opening one production facility and closing another. And yet a handful of them we do see are names that we would recognize as former craft distillers. One note I want to make: when we look at the ADI directory that you all received this morning, in the early years that I analyzed, usually about maybe a third or 40%, 35%, somewhere in there, of the listings, of the new listings in a given year, we would have seen as already being in production. Over the last few years, that number has jumped tremendously. So we used to see people joining ADI, getting listed as under construction or something like that in the directory, and then a year later, 2 years later, they would actually be in the market as producers. Now it's the reverse. We see distilleries getting their TTB DSP license, getting up and running into the market, and then joining ADI or getting listed in the directory. So the dynamics have shifted a little bit, and things are happening faster. I put this chart in there. The gold bars there are the numbers that we actually see that I can identify as in the market and producers. The red bars there with those asterisks are what we're estimating those numbers actually are. And there's a huge gap there in the last couple of years for this reason that I just described, that we're seeing people get their licenses, get up and running, and then they're finding ADI and joining and getting listed in the directory rather than the previous dynamic. And so now, in production craft distilleries, I think we're somewhere at the 1,100 range. I do think that the number of new entrants is starting to slow down a little bit, and we'll see what's going on there as time moves forward. So what are they making? Well, whiskey has become the predominant spirit for the new craft distiller entrants. In the early years, you'll see that other category was quite significant, and I should note that because distilleries can make multiple product lines, these numbers add up to more than 100%, of course. The early years of the craft distilling market, we had a lot of wineries making brandy, and that was a predominant part of the market. That has really shifted in the last 5 to 10 years, with new entrants from scratch coming in to make vodka, to make gin, to make rum, to make whiskey, but fewer of them are making brandy, obviously. I also want to point out, just at the whiskey category, this is looking, we bunch a bunch of those, and then in the last 3 years break them out individually. We saw upwards of 75% of craft distilleries making whiskey, new entrants in the last few years. Yet this year, that number was significantly lower, and I believe that's because of this entrant gap, where you have people out there making whiskey who have not declared themselves yet because they're laying barrels down, but we'll see them come into the market in the next couple, 3 years when they start to release product. Throw your mind back here 10 years, right? Not very long ago, this was what the landscape looked like. 22 states did not have a craft distillery 10 years ago, and 16 states had only one. 12 states had more than one. I think the majority of those had two, and you only had 3 states with more than 5 craft distilleries in the whole country. And this is what we look like now. I would note that the white there is actually, every state has at least 2 craft distilleries now. The white there is less than 5, not zeros. And we've got Washington State with 84, California 79, New York 77, and a host of states with 25 to 50 in there. Vastly different landscape now, obviously, right? 10 years ago, you could enter the market and be the first craft distillery in Missouri, and you could make a marketing claim on that basis. Now you're number 19. It's a little harder to differentiate as you think about how you're going to build your business, but I do believe that differentiation is the key to success in this market. And here we can see the progression, the full progression. So as we've seen the craft beer market grow from nothing to over 5,000 entrants now, and I think the US wine market has over 8,000 unique operators. Still tremendous room to grow in the craft distilled spirits market. It does look like we may be hitting a bit of a slowdown in the growth, or maybe we'll see a little bit of consolidation as the market tries to absorb all of the new entrants, all of the new products that are coming to market, and the distributors start to get their head around what this all means. However, I do think that the other side of this increased supply is the increased demand coming from the next generation of consumers, particularly the millennials. They are not so brand loyal. They split much more evenly, male and female, in terms of their taste preferences, unlike the older generation of drinkers, where you had men drinking brown spirits and women drinking white spirits. So I think the opportunity set for the craft distillers going forward over the next 10, 15, 20 years is still enormous. Conclusion notes, I still think the number of craft distillers is going to reach 2,000 within 5 years, but we have started to see exits become part of the landscape. We're still solidly in the early adopter phase. Maybe in another couple, 3 years, we'll be moving on into the early majority phase, but we're still at maybe 2% market penetration, whereas craft brewers are in the 15 to 20% market penetration phase. And this is a classic, growth pattern of a renewal of many industry resurgences have seen. And I have no sense of what the ceiling is in terms of market share for either craft beer or craft spirits. One expert academic in the craft, who knows a lot about the craft beer market, a lot about these market changes. I asked him, he said his guess was, I don't know, 70%, 75%. So imagine a landscape where instead of craft beer having 5,000 entrants and 15 to 20% market share, imagine 25,000 entrants and 75% market share. It's not inconceivable. It's not inconceivable that the craft distilled spirits market could see tremendous, or that the distilled spirits market generally could undergo the same kind of disaggregation and back to a much more distributed production and distribution model. That's all I have. Feel free to find me and ask questions after this talk, and thanks very much. Enjoy the conference.
Well, along with that growth, we're now finding that we do have craft distillers in all 50 states, and we, the last time I checked, had people at this conference from 44 different states. We are all over the map, and there's an important subject we'd like to bring up. We've got a speaker for you who's not on the program, but it's important to bring you up to date on an issue that we feel you all should be getting involved in, because we have a golden opportunity right now for tax parity. And the federal excise tax right now in the current Congress, which is really tax reform minded, there's a tremendous opportunity with Senate Bill 236 and House Bill 747 that we could actually see distilled spirits taxed on an equal level with beers and wines, and that would be a tremendous relief to all of you. And these bills right now, the House bill enjoys sponsorship by 2/3 of the House, and the Senate bill is sponsored by more than half the Senate. So there really is a tremendous chance, and it's bipartisan support. If you count down the number of sponsors on each, it's split between the two parties. And we have a gentleman here who is a tax policy advisor to the Senate Finance Committee, and I would like you all to welcome Christopher Arneson.
All right, thanks so much, Drew, and thanks everybody for the invitation to speak here today. I just want to start, before I get into things, because I work for the government, I have to say that I'm here in my own capacity as an individual, and any of my statements are not directly attributable. So with that, I've had the opportunity to work with some of you before. I work on the Senate Finance Committee. That committee is responsible for taxes and trade policy generally, but is also responsible for issues including alcohol excise tax and regulation. So my boss, Senator Wyden, who's a top Democrat on the Finance Committee, introduced the Craft Beverage Modernization Tax Reform Act, which would significantly cut alcohol excise taxes for distillers, and particularly small distillers. It would also revise and streamline a lot of the alcohol excise regulations that you guys deal with today. So one bill you may be familiar with is the the Craft Beverage Startup Act. That's legislation that passed at the end of 2015 that said the smallest 90% of distillers don't have to have a TTB bond. So if you've either gotten your bond back or you're planning on attending the TTB session later today that tells you how to do that, you can keep that in mind. The other thing I want to say is, before I get too far along, I have to be a little careful with what I say here today. And that's because every time we have an excise tax bill going to the floor, where we finally think we're going to get this thing passed, I start getting phone calls from all over the Senate. And it's my colleagues and other offices, and they say, "Chris, what on earth did you say to the distillers? They won't stop calling me." And that's when I have to tell them that you guys are folks that are self-starters. You're folks that take challenges head on, and I think that's the kind of enthusiasm that folks in Washington don't see. So speaking here today, one of my goals is to help you guys translate that enthusiasm into real policy change by helping you steer it, craft it a little better, polish it, and hopefully we can get something passed. And it's not surprising that you guys have this kind of enthusiasm. You know, you all at some point dove headfirst into an industry that probably was not that open to small distillers. You know, it was, and in some ways still is, an industry that's dominated by the big players, that is subject to arcane prohibition-era rules that no one really knows what they mean, and you know, people that try to do what you do all day, it's hard to keep track of them and stay compliant with them. And you know, when many of you started, it probably wasn't even clear if your business model will succeed. And yet, here we are with 1,500 small distillers from across the country, all talking about how to grow their industry and how to write the next chapter in federal alcohol tax policy. So thinking through how we can sort of translate your enthusiasm into policy change in Washington, D.C., we really have to start with the fact that Washington is a weird place. You know, they all speak their own bureaucratic jargon that's hard to cut through. And sometimes the priorities of Congress are really difficult to pick apart. So as we go through some of these pointers I'm going to give you, just ask you to have sort of an open mind and think about how the folks in Washington might view these things, or how stakeholders might view these things, and how we can work together to get some of these changes enacted. So the first tip I want to give you is to make sure you have a unified message. You know, the easiest way to kill any proposal in Washington is to have a conflicting or confusing message. When lawmakers hear that, they automatically assume the best option is to just do nothing at all. Fortunately, you guys have this one solved. We have the Craft Beverage Modernization and Tax Reform Act, as Drew was mentioning earlier. And that bill is supported by not only big distillers and small distillers, but also big brewers and small brewers, and the whole wine industry and the whole cider industry, and beer, wine, and spirits distributors. So we've managed to go from, in the history, back you know, a few years ago, where we had sort of each industry group pushing their own bill. We've now brought them all together. We brought everyone to the table, and everyone is working to push the same package. And as a result, we've had really incredible success in building support, and have had a few chances to get it enacted. And I think if we can keep the momentum up this year, there's a good chance that it could be attached to whatever tax reform or other large tax cut package we expect to see. So that sort of leads to the second point, which is build coalitions. You know, now we're all supporting the same bill. The next part of this is making sure everyone's working together. You know, distillers bring unique talents. You know, first and foremost is your incredible enthusiasm on this issue. But also, you have to remember Congress is geographically and ideologically diverse. So there may be certain states or certain regions where distillers are the key players in the local economy. There are other areas where small brewers or wineries play a bigger role. And so by coordinating your efforts with them, you can make sure that your outreach to lawmakers is as effective as possible. And it also makes it much easier for lawmakers to support your bill if you go in as a group. Maybe you have a distiller, a brewer, a vintner, a cider maker, and it's easy for the lawmakers to see everyone's on the same page and everyone wants to work together. So second point there is coordinate and build coalitions. Moving on, the third point, and I think this might be the real critical one, is to be part of a story. So many of you live far away from DC. You spend most of your time focused on running your business, and maybe you only make it to DC once a year, or maybe not at all. After all, you're not politicians. But I want to ask you to think like politicians for a minute, because that's crucial to making sure that we really get through to them here. So the art of politics is not transactional science. It's certainly an art, and it's about building relationships. So when you look at what a lawmaker does, a lawmaker tells a story. That's their number one thing, is they are constantly working to tell a story about how they are doing good things for people back home. doing good things for their constituents. And so as you work with lawmakers, think of it less as a transaction and more as an opportunity to help them tell that story. You guys have a great story to tell. You created an industry out of nothing except creativity and hard work. And you're creating products that have never existed before, or at least didn't exist before Prohibition. And it's that novel approach that I think lawmakers really appreciate. And so you're creating new products, you're growing jobs, you're growing the local economies. And those are very, very compelling stories to tell to lawmakers. So I would say use that good work and find ways to help lawmakers be part of your story or make your story part of their story, so that they can show that they're working together with the folks in their communities who are creating jobs. The other thing I'll say here is you have to tell them you're doing good things. You have to tell them that you are creating those jobs, hiring people. Let them know if you host a charitable event. Let them know if you make a new investment somewhere. Otherwise, there's no way for them to know what sort of progress you're making. So keep them up to speed on the latest developments with your business. And the other thing I'll say here is it gets specific. People like to talk about creating jobs, but it means so much more if you can say, no, I'm going to build this new building. I'm going to buy this new still. I'm going to hire so many new workers. So as you're talking with lawmakers today about the good work you do, get specific. And when we talk about the benefits of passing excise tax reform, have a look at the tax cuts that are in that bill. Have a look at the regulatory improvements. And if you can calculate out how many new jobs you'd create or what specific new investments you'd make with this tax cut, you can make a much more compelling case to these lawmakers. And then the final thing here is, I know many of you already do this, but invite lawmakers out to your operations. Show them the good work that's going on. Show them the investments you're making. It's much easier to convince somebody that you're doing good work when they can see it on the ground, when they can see people working in high-skilled, well-paying jobs. And that helps you tell the story that we should be doing more of it. So the last thing I'll tell you is that this is all really in your hands. Senator Wyden is certainly your biggest advocate on Capitol Hill, and he's going to keep pushing this bill. And you have organizations like this organization, like ACSA, like Discus, many others, who all work in the advocacy space, and they provide a useful service in typing up talking points and aligning messaging and arranging meetings and sort of getting everyone on the same page. But at the end of the day, none of us are going to be able to convince every lawmaker they need to vote for this thing, and that's why it's up to you guys to make time to go speak with your legislators, go talk with them, explain to them why this is important and how this will help your local community. And that's, at the end of the day, is what it's going to take to get this thing across the finish line. I do truly believe we can get this thing across the finish line. As Drew said earlier, we had last year more than half the Senate supported the bill on an exactly bipartisan basis. In the House, we had 2/3 of the House supporting the bill. And we came very close to passing it twice. It just happened that the cookie didn't crumble our way. But we do know that there's going to be very big tax legislation coming through the Congress this year. And the question is really, not if there's going to be a tax bill, but whether a tax bill is going to include the craft beverages bill. And with all your hard work, I hope it does. So thanks everybody for letting me talk for a little while. I look forward to working with all of you, and I look forward to seeing each and every one of you around the Capitol in the next year talking with your lawmakers.